I was walking back from the bathroom in my thin robe, the one with the loose sash and faded seams that I only wore late at night when the house had already fallen into that kind of quiet where your own footsteps sound like a question. And as I passed the guest room door, which he never fully shut, I saw him sitting on the edge of the bed in a t-shirt, his hair still wet after a shower while the soft blue fan buzzed to life beside him. And just as our eyes met for the first time like that, direct and unfiltered and electric, he smiled without hesitation and said, "Too hot to sleep," in a voice that didn't ask anything from me, yet made my breath falter so completely that I didn't reply, didn't even nod, just kept walking with my heart banging against my ribs and my throat suddenly dry like the summer heat had slipped down inside my chest, and decided to stay. It had started 3 weeks earlier when Michael told me over breakfast that Nathan would be staying with us for the summer, said it casually between a bite of toast and a sip of coffee like he was offering weekend plans, not shifting the gravity of our household. And I remember staring at the jam spoon as he explained that his sister's boy had landed some architecture internship in the city, that housing was too expensive, that it would just be for a couple of months, and he'd be out most of the day anyway, so we'd barely even notice. And I told myself this was fine. Of course it was fine. Because family was family, and I had always said yes before thinking too hard, and maybe that was part of the problem. Nathan arrived on a Saturday morning in an old green car that rattled in reverse and had one of those little pine tree air fresheners hanging crooked from the mirror, and he stepped out looking like a photograph from a magazine no one admitted buying, tall with that easy tan boys get when they don't mind sunburn and a kind of calm in his shoulders that made you think he never raised his voice unless he meant it. And when he hugged Michael and then turned to me with a quiet smile and said my name the way people do when they already know they'll remember it, I felt something shift inside me so small I almost missed it. That first dinner was nothing special. On the surface, just my usual baked chicken and salad with a cold bottle of white wine sweating on the table, and yet I found myself watching him in the smallest ways, noticing how he passed the bread without interrupting anyone's sentence, how he waited until I finished chewing before asking me anything, how he offered to help with the dishes, and actually dried each plate with care like it mattered where they ended up. And even though there was nothing in his gestures that crossed a line, I felt seen in a way I hadn't been in longer than I wanted to admit. The next morning, I was standing at the sink watching the coffee drip into the pot when I noticed movement in the backyard, and there he was jogging slowly along the edge of the garden in a gray tank top that clung to his shoulders like the air itself wanted to stay close to him, his pace steady and unbothered as if the heat was a thing he had already made peace with. And I didn't mean to stare, but something about the rhythm of his stride and the way the sunlight slid over his skin kept me frozen there a few seconds, longer than made sense. And when he caught me watching from behind the curtain, I ducked away like I'd touched a stove. A few days later, I was reorganizing the hall closet when the top shelf gave a groan and then a full snap, and I cursed under my breath, not too loud, but loud enough, because before I could reach for a broom or step stool, he was already there, sleeves rolled up and a screwdriver in hand like he'd been waiting for a reason to help, and while he fixed the bracket and realigned the hinge, I held the light without speaking, and something about the silence between us felt unusually full, as though the conversation was happening anyway and both of us had decided not to say it out loud. Later that same afternoon, when I was kneeling in the garden pulling weeds from under the hydrangeas, I heard footsteps, and there he was again with his hands in his pockets asking if I needed help, and even though I said no, I let him stay. And we worked side by side in the dirt without much talking, but with an ease that built itself from breath and motion and proximity until I looked up at him brushing the soil from his palms and realized I hadn't thought about Michael once in the past hour. That evening, Michael suggested a movie night in the den, said we hadn't done it in a while, and maybe it'd be nice, so I made popcorn and he picked one of those crime dramas he liked that always started slow and ended with someone confessing in a courthouse, and Nathan sat beside me on the couch while Michael sat in the recliner, and somewhere around the middle of the film, when the dialogue turned to legalese and my husband drifted off with his mouth slightly open, I felt Nathan's leg brush mine, not much, just enough to feel, and I realized for the first time that he was sitting a little too close. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it, that I was tired and distracted and craving attention that had nothing to do with reality. And yet that night when I got up to get water, I found a mug on the counter with a tea bag still floating in it, and next to it, as if placed deliberately, was the photo of me and Michael from our 10th anniversary in a silver frame now lying face down, like it had been turned with purpose. And although I flipped it back up and wiped the glass clean, I didn't put it back on the shelf. I left it standing there in the corner with the edge of the frame just barely tilted as though waiting for someone else to notice. The next morning, I woke up unsettled, not from any dream I could remember, but from the way the light felt different in the bedroom, a little too sharp at the corners, a little too loud across the sheets, and as I made the bed, I kept thinking, About that photo frame on the kitchen counter and the mug left beside it like a trail left not for cleaning but for discovery. And even though I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe Nathan had just made tea and forgot about it and bumped the frame by accident, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an accident at all, that it had been intentional. In some way I didn't yet have the language to name. Michael didn't notice any of it, not the subtle shift in the atmosphere, not the way I stood too long near the sink, not the way Nathan offered to water the plants, and then did so without being asked again. He was buried in work most nights, glued to his laptop with spreadsheets glowing blue on his face and the soft tap of keys filling the silence like rainfall. And even when I mentioned that maybe Nathan was still figuring things out, that maybe he was a little unrooted or searching for something deeper than just career clarity, Michael just nodded absently and said something about how he's young. They all drift for a while, before returning to whatever quarterly update had taken priority over real conversation. By the 4th week, the routine had settled like dust in old carpet. We moved around each other with practiced familiarity, Nathan and I, with nods and passing gestures and that quiet kind of cooperation that makes even the simplest tasks feel laced with something unsaid. And it was during one of those afternoons when I was folding towels in the hallway closet that he came up behind me without a sound and asked if I needed help carrying them to the bathroom, and the way he reached out and took the stack from my arms so naturally made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, noticed, not for what I was doing, but for the fact that I was there. That evening, as the sun dragged its orange tail across the backyard and the shadows from the trees reached long across the porch, we had dinner again, this time just the 3 of us, like usual, but something was different. Nathan had cooked pasta with basil and parmesan, and Michael was running late from work, stuck in a meeting about quarterly projections or vendor invoices or something equally uninspired. So it was just the 2 of us at the table at first, the plates steaming gently between us while the soft hum of the dishwasher filled the pauses. And when I thanked him for the meal, he looked up and said, "You smile more when he's not around." And even though I laughed it off with a shake of my head, I felt that comment like a hand pressed gently against my ribs. Over the next few days, I began to notice things I wasn't supposed to. How Nathan started wearing shirts in shades I'd once told Michael I liked. How he placed his coffee cup in the exact spot I always left mine. How he adjusted the blinds in the morning the same way I did to avoid the glare on the counter, and none of it was dramatic or overt or particularly intimate, but it was there. Like a quiet echo of my own habits mirrored back to me, like a reflection I hadn't expected to see in someone else so soon or so precisely. One night, after midnight, I heard music faintly humming from the guest room, a soft acoustic guitar line weaving through the air like breath made audible, and I got up, not thinking, just following the sound the way you might follow the smell of something familiar from your childhood. And I stood outside his door with my fingers brushing the frame, not quite knocking, not quite walking away, just listening and breathing, and not understanding why the weight of that moment felt heavier than any words we might have spoken if I had dared open it, but I didn't go in. Instead, I stood there for a long minute until the water pipes behind the walls thudded and I heard the rush of Michael's shower turning on from the other side of the house, and I suddenly felt cold and guilty and foolish in a way I hadn't felt since I was 17. So I turned away and walked back to bed, curling up on my side with the blanket pulled over my shoulders like a child trying to hide from thunder. The next morning I woke early, thinking I had the house to myself, and padded into the kitchen still in my robe, hair up, skin bare beneath the fabric, only to freeze when I saw him already there, standing at the fridge in nothing but a towel slung low on his hips, his hair still wet from the shower, and a lazy grin on his face as he turned slightly and said, "Good morning," like this was the most normal thing in the world. And I stood still for one heartbeat too long before turning abruptly toward the spice rack and pretending I had come in looking for salt. That would have been manageable if not for the sound of the front door opening just seconds later and Michael's voice calling out that he'd brought coffee. And in that moment, the room shifted again. The air thickened, my heart kicked into my throat, and I felt the shape of something forming that none of us had asked for, but all of us had already invited, in without meaning to. That afternoon, the sun felt heavier than usual, not cruel, but clingy. The kind of heat that presses against your skin like a whisper you can't shake. And I had moved my laptop to the backyard table because the kitchen felt too still and the living room too obvious. And as I tried to concentrate, on the spreadsheet open in front of me with its neat columns and blinking cursor, I heard the screen door slide open behind me and the soft rhythm of footsteps stepping onto the patio. And before I even turned, I knew it was him because something about his presence always filled the space a second before he spoke. He said he was watering the flowers. Voice light and casual like it was the most natural thing to hold a green hose in one hand and stroll barefoot along the edge of the garden like a boy on summer break. And without looking up from my laptop, I smiled and said, "Just don't hit me," with that half-joking tone you use when you mean to be charming but don't expect an answer. And in the very next second, the icy spray of water hit the side of my arm and chest, soaking through the cotton of my tank top and pulling a yelp of laughter from my throat before I could stop it. I stood up so fast the chair scraped the stones, clutching the front of my shirt where the fabric clung to me like wet paper, and I turned to him with a mix of surprise and mock accusation. But he was already laughing, eyes wide with something between mischief and apology, and the sound of it, his laugh, rolled through the heat like wind and made something inside me flicker that I didn't want to name, because even as I scolded him with narrowed eyes, I felt myself smiling in spite of it, felt the tension loosen in my chest in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. He rushed forward with a towel draped over his shoulder and held it out to me without a word, the gesture simple but full, and as I reached for it, our hands touched, not briefly or accidentally, but with a kind of stillness that made the air pause between us. And he didn't pull away, and neither did I, not at first. And in that moment, his eyes didn't drift or blink or break contact, and there was nothing loud in the way he looked at me, but it landed with the weight of something I knew I'd remember. So I took the towel, wrapped it around my shoulders, and walked back into the house with my pulse tapping at my throat like it had something urgent to say. Later that evening, when I sat across from Michael in the kitchen, I brought it up, not the towel or the look or the laugh, but Nathan in general, his presence. His sudden maturity and strange stillness, and the way he seemed always halfway into a conversation you didn't know had started. And I said something vague about transition and how some people get stuck between versions of themselves. Said that maybe Nathan was still finding his place, still a little unstable in that floating 20-something way. And Michael, without lifting his eyes from the report in his hand, nodded absently and said, "Sure, probably," before flipping the page and reaching for his pen, like the boy in our guest room didn't carry any weight at all. Dinner that night was his idea, Nathan's pasta again, but this time with red chili flakes and fresh parsley and garlic that lingered even after we cleared the plates, and Michael had texted that he'd be late due to another vendor call, which meant it was just the two of us again. Just me and him and the soft amber glow of the pendant lights above the table, and somewhere between the first bite and the second refill of sparkling water, he looked at me with that same slow focus and said, "You smile more when he's not around." Not like an accusation, not even like a compliment, but like a simple truth placed between us on the table like silverware. I didn't answer him, not directly, just looked down and traced a line across my napkin with the edge of my thumb, but inside I felt it stir again, that strange combination of shame and thrill and something else that felt a little too close to clarity. And after he went upstairs and I stayed behind to rinse the plates, I noticed he'd left his cup in the exact same corner of the counter where I always put mine. Not by the sink or the drying rack, but that same square inch where the tile is slightly chipped and no one else ever uses it. It was around midnight when I woke to the sound of soft strumming, that familiar rise and fall of acoustic guitar chords that felt more like breath than music, and I slipped out of bed without thinking, feet light on the hallway wood, drawn again toward the guest room like a tide you can't stop. And when I reached the door, it was half open and I could see him, sitting on the edge of the bed with the guitar balanced on his knee and his head tilted slightly as he played, eyes closed and mouth moving with words I couldn't hear but somehow understood anyway. I stood there watching for longer than I should have, hand on the doorframe, bare feet curling slightly on the floor, and I almost stepped inside, almost crossed that invisible line, when suddenly I heard the pipes shift and the familiar thump of Michael turning on the upstairs shower, and just like that, I pulled away from the doorway and turned down the hall, breath catching like it had earlier that night with the hose. But this time the air wasn't warm or full of laughter. It was thin and sharp and full of restraint. The next morning I moved slower than usual, not out of tiredness, but from that strange fog that comes when your thoughts are too loud and your body pretends not to notice. And as I shuffled into the kitchen still in my robe, hair pulled up loosely and slippers barely on my feet, I assumed the house was empty because it was too early for Michael and too late for Nathan's run, and I didn't expect to see anyone until I'd had coffee and silence in equal measure. But as I stepped through the doorway, I stopped dead because he was already there, standing in front of the open refrigerator with his back to me, a white towel wrapped around his waist, bare from the waist up, his skin still damp from the shower and his hair wet and curling at the edges like it had the day I first saw him in the hallway. He turned at the sound of my breath catching and smiled softly like we were just two people who accidentally crossed paths in a quiet morning and nothing more. But the way his eyes moved, down my robe, pausing slightly where the fabric met skin, and back up again to meet my gaze, made it impossible to pretend I hadn't just walked into something fragile and dangerous and already half alive. And for a second, neither of us said anything, just stood there in the stillness with the fridge humming behind him and my pulse pounding in my ears. I looked away first, of course I did, turned abruptly toward the cabinet and reached for the spice rack with no intention of using it, only needing my hands to move, to do something that resembled normal. And just as I opened the cabinet door, I heard the front door open behind me, heard the familiar rustle of a paper bag and the unmistakable jingle of Michael's keys, and I froze for the smallest moment because I knew how this looked. Even if nothing had happened, even if the air between us was only full of almosts and maybes. Michael's voice called out before he appeared, bright and casual like it always was in the mornings. I brought coffee, and then he stepped into the room and saw me facing the cabinet in my robe and Nathan standing near the fridge in a towel, and for a heartbeat too long, no one spoke. Not because there was guilt, but because there was possibility. And even silence can be a confession when it lands at the wrong time. I turned quickly and smiled too fast and too wide, reaching into the spice rack and saying something about needing salt for the eggs I hadn't even cracked yet, pretending like nothing was strange, like the air wasn't thick enough to chew. And Nathan, to his credit, didn't flinch, just grabbed the water bottle he'd been reaching for and said good morning to Michael, with the same even voice he used, for everything, which somehow made it worse. Michael didn't seem to notice, or maybe he chose not to because that was his way. He handed me the coffee like a man delivering peace, kissed the top of my head absently, and went upstairs to change, leaving me alone again in the kitchen where I stood frozen with the spice jar still in my hand and Nathan still at my back. And all I could think was how quickly things become impossible to explain once you stop being careful. I tried to carry on as if nothing had happened, tried to slide back into the routine of the morning with coffee and news and light conversation, but my thoughts kept circling the way he looked at me when I walked in, the way his eyes had paused without apology, the way his presence filled the space like a shadow you never noticed until it moved. And all day I walked through the hours with that look still clinging to me like the wet cotton of my shirt the day before. That night, while Michael fell asleep on the couch with the TV flickering across his face, I stood in the hallway outside, Nathan's door again, not moving this time, not reaching, just listening. But the guitar was quiet and the room was dark, and I felt both grateful and disappointed, like part of me had hoped the music would pull me back in while the other part needed desperately to stay out. When I finally went to bed, I lay there with my eyes open staring at the ceiling fan, thinking about how laughter can leave echoes, how a look can stay longer than it should, how a moment that doesn't go too far can still go too deep. And I knew then that the line we hadn't crossed was already behind us, that everything ahead would be made of decisions I hadn't planned to make. After the kitchen, after the towel, after the sound of Michael's keys jangling in the lock like a warning I hadn't asked for, I told myself I needed to draw a line, not with words but with distance, with the kind of careful indifference that women learn to perform when something goes a little too far and cannot be undone but still needs to be hidden inside something polite. So I started moving through the house like a shadow that no longer lingered, answering Nathan only when necessary, avoiding eye contact that might last too long, folding my arms when he entered the room not because I was cold, but because I needed to remind myself that boundaries were still possible. But if I was trying to create space, he was trying to erase it, not through bold declarations or reckless gestures, but through quiet persistence that felt too calm to accuse and too intentional to ignore, like when I bent down to pick up a dropped napkin and he was suddenly beside me, reaching at the same time with a look that asked nothing, yet held everything. Or when we crossed paths in the hallway and instead of stepping aside, he stood still for just a second longer than needed. Not blocking, but watching, not imposing, but anchoring himself in a way that made me aware of my own heartbeat in my throat. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic, but it built a pressure in me that I couldn't exhale. And that's why on a warm Thursday morning with the air thick and the walls feeling too close, I got on my bicycle without breakfast or plan, and rode toward the edge of town where the park opened up wide and green and empty. Because sometimes you don't run from people. You run from the mirror they hold up too steadily, and I needed to forget the way he looked at me like he already knew what I would do next. The ride helped for exactly 15 minutes until I heard the familiar rhythm of footsteps behind me and turned to see him jogging slowly up the trail. Not winded, not smiling, just steady like he'd known exactly where I'd go and gave me space until I needed to be found. And when he caught up to me, he said, "You're avoiding me." Not accusing, not even questioning, and I said, "Maybe I should," with a tightness in my chest that didn't match the warmth of the sun. We didn't speak after that, not at first. Just kept walking until we reached the far end of the lake, where the trees leaned low and the ground dipped slightly toward the water, and we sat without looking at each other. The silence between us filled with rustling branches and distant birds and the soft lapping of waves that didn't care what we were trying to hide. And then he said it, low and certain, like he wasn't hoping for a reaction, but simply stating a fact. "Michael doesn't look at you." And before I could stop myself, I whispered, "You're a child," with no real force behind it, and he said, "Then why do I feel more than he does?" I didn't answer, Not because I didn't have thoughts, but because none of them made sense when I tried to shape them into words. And there are moments in life when silence becomes the loudest thing in the room, when you sit beside someone who shouldn't matter this much and feel your defenses peeling off like old paint. And as I stared at the water that glittered like glass, I felt the space between us narrow not with movement but with decision. And then he leaned in, not rushed, not eager, just present, and kissed me. At first it was light, tentative, a question, asked with lips instead of words. But when I didn't pull away, when I didn't stiffen or object or laugh it off with one of those nervous jokes I sometimes use when things get too real, he kissed me again with more purpose, with the kind of heat that doesn't burn but seeps. And I let him because in that moment I didn't feel like a wife or a mistake or a woman making bad choices. I felt like someone who had been invisible too long and suddenly wasn't. I don't remember how long we stayed like that, only that when we parted it was slower than I expected. Like neither of us wanted to be the first to admit what had happened. And we didn't speak as we stood and dusted the grass off our legs. And we didn't walk home together, didn't even take the same path. He left first and I stayed behind pretending to check my phone, pretending I hadn't just crossed the kind of line that comes with no exit map and no way to go back. When I got home, the sky was already orange and the kitchen smelled like garlic and basil. And I stood in front of the mirror in the downstairs bathroom, staring at my reflection like it belonged to someone else. Someone who had secrets in her mouth and sunlight on her collarbone, and a pulse that couldn't lie no matter how calm her. Hands appeared, and I touched my lips with 2 fingers just to feel if they were still mine. Not because I regretted it, not because I was proud, but because I couldn't tell if the feeling in my chest was guilt or exhilaration or something tangled between them. That evening, I cooked without looking at the recipe, letting my hands move on autopilot through familiar motions of rinsing lettuce, slicing tomatoes, and stirring dressing into the same old wooden bowl I'd had since my bridal shower. And when Michael walked through the door and kissed my cheek, like nothing in the world had shifted, I smiled because my face knew how, even as something inside me twisted with a nervous ache that hadn't stopped since the lake, and the way Nathan's breath had touched my skin like a promise that didn't need to be spoken. At dinner, Michael complimented the salad like he always did when he was too tired to notice much else, and I said thank you like I always had. But when I looked at his hands wrapped around the glass and watched the way he absent-mindedly tapped his thumb against the rim, all I could think about was the warmth of a different hand against the small of my back, the weight of a gaze that didn't wander, the way silence with Nathan felt louder than full conversations with the man across the table from me. And even though nothing about Michael had changed, even though he was exactly who he had always been, kind, steady, predictable, I felt a distance grow between us that hadn't been there before and couldn't be explained away with fatigue or stress, or years of shared routine. I cleared the plates and wiped the counter while he read something on his phone, the soft hum of his voice now and then as he responded to a message, and the entire time I moved through the kitchen could still feel the memory of our closeness, lingering in my thoughts, not urgent but unshakable. And when I turned off the last light and walked up the stairs, I realized I didn't want to know what it meant. Only that it had happened, and that my body remembered every detail whether I wanted it to or not. That night, long after Michael had fallen asleep with the sheets kicked off and the ceiling fan humming like a lullaby meant for someone else, I sat upright in bed with the glow of my phone screen lighting my lap, and my thoughts tangled in circles that couldn't find their way out. And when I finally put the phone down and turned off the light, I stared into the darkness, not blinking, not breathing quite right, waiting for the house to settle into the kind of silence that makes sound feel like betrayal. I heard it a few minutes later. 3 soft knocks at the door, not rushed, not uncertain, but with the kind of rhythm that made my entire body tense, with recognition. And I didn't move at first because everything in me screamed not to, not now, not again. But I threw the covers back anyway, and walked to the door barefoot and breathless, my fingers wrapping around the knob before my brain caught up to what they were doing. And I stood there with my forehead against the wood and my hand resting on the cold metal like it was the only thing keeping me from crumbling. He didn't knock again. He didn't speak, but I knew it was him standing there. I could feel it through the door like static electricity just beneath the surface of the paint, and I didn't open it. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew if I did, something irreversible would happen, and there would be no way to pretend I didn't choose it, no way to bury it beneath excuses or blurred memory. So I just stood there in the dark with my palm on the doorknob and my breath shallow in my chest. And I stayed like that until the sky outside the window turned from black to the bruised blue of early morning, and the world began to stir again with the sound of birds and the distant roll of garbage trucks. By the time I finally moved away from the door and climbed back into bed, my hand felt numb and my heart felt hollow in a way that didn't hurt exactly, but left a kind of echo behind, like something had almost happened and the ghost of it stayed long after the footsteps had faded down the hall. and when I closed my eyes, I didn't fall asleep. I drifted somewhere between dreams and memory. And when I heard Michael stir beside me and reach blindly for his alarm, I rolled toward him and let him hold me because routine is a kind of safety, even when it no longer feels true. I said nothing, Nathan said nothing. But something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but deep beneath the surface where all real change begins. And I knew that no matter how many mornings I poured the coffee or folded the towels or walked the dog with Michael by my side, there would always be a piece of me back at that lakeside kiss, that silent knock, that door I hadn't opened but hadn't walked away from either. The rain came without warning that evening, not in sudden thunder or chaos, but in a steady rhythm that tapped against the windows like a soft drumbeat, reminding me that time was moving forward, whether I was ready or not. And as the clouds folded themselves over the neighborhood and the light dimmed across the kitchen counters and hallway walls, Michael packed his things for the overnight shift without complaint, slipping his watch onto his wrist and checking his phone for texts from his supervisor while I leaned against the doorframe pretending I was listening as he reminded me where the spare batteries were and what time he'd be back in the morning. And when he kissed my cheek, it felt like a gesture from an old movie I'd seen too many times to still believe in. After the car pulled away and the house fell into silence, except for the ticking of the hallway clock and the gentle percussion of the rain, I didn't go downstairs to turn on the lights or fold the laundry still waiting in the basket. I went into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed without taking off my shoes, staring at the floor like something might shift if I looked long enough. And I don't know how long I stayed like that before I heard the sound of footsteps, and then the soft creak of the door. And when I looked up, he was there. Nathan, standing just inside the threshold with the rain behind him like a frame and his voice low and certain as he said, "We already started something," like he wasn't afraid of what it meant. I didn't answer right away because part of me still thought I could stop it if I stayed quiet long enough, if I folded my hands in my lap and looked away and counted my breaths like a woman trying to pray away temptation. But when I finally found my voice, it came out barely above a whisper, and it trembled with all the things I couldn't say. "This is wrong," I said, not because I didn't want it, but because I did, and that scared me more than anything else. He didn't argue or justify or try to win me over with charm or reasoning. He just walked slowly across the room until he was close enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin. And then he reached for my hand, not forcefully, but deliberately, and when his fingers brushed mine, I didn't pull away because my body had already decided long before my mind caught up, and the second he touched me, the air between us shifted into something sharp and undeniable, and the space I had tried to create folded into nothing. The kiss happened like a slow unraveling, not a collision, but a revelation. His lips met mine slowly, with a quietness that asked for nothing but acknowledgement, not from hesitation, but from the way he waited for me to answer with my own mouth. And when I did, when I leaned forward and kissed him back with a hunger that came from years of being half seen and barely held, I felt something break open inside me, something deep and forgotten that hadn't stirred since before I learned how to keep my desires quiet and manageable. He touched my face like he was memorizing it, his fingers moving along my jaw and cheek and temple with a tenderness that made my throat tighten, not because I doubted him, but because I hadn't been touched like that in longer than I wanted to admit. And the way he looked at me, not as a woman he wanted, but as someone he already knew, made me feel more naked than any kiss could. We moved carefully, without haste, and as we lay down together, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. I hadn't expected and didn't know I needed until that very moment, and every breath he gave me felt like an answer to a question I'd never dared ask out loud. I watched him as he moved, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to remember every second of it. The way his eyes never drifted from mine, the way his body folded into mine like it had always known the shape of my longing, the way the sound of rain outside grew softer the longer we stayed together, as if the world had decided to quiet down in respect for something that shouldn't have happened but couldn't be stopped. Afterward, the room didn't feel broken or ruined. It felt charged, like the walls had absorbed something electric and didn't know what to do with it. And we lay there in the stillness, our breath slowly sinking back into rhythm with the rain, and I turned to him and said, "I'm scared." Not because I needed comfort, but because I needed honesty more than anything. And he looked at me without flinching and said, "I'm not." And I replied, "I am." One more time just to hear it spoken aloud, and he touched my hand and said, "Then I'll carry that too," like it was the most natural promise in the world. By the time the sky began to fade from charcoal gray to the first pale wash of morning, I had already risen from the bed and gathered my robe from the floor without a word, not because I wanted to pretend the night hadn't happened, but because part of me still needed to hold on to the illusion of normal. And as I stood by the window, Watching the last drops of rain slide down the glass like they were trying to retrace their path, I could hear Nathan behind me breathing steady and calm, the same rhythm he had when he jogged or concentrated or listened to music. And I realized how deeply I had memorized the sounds he made without ever meaning to. I didn't say anything as I moved around the room, picking up the book I had left on the nightstand, folding the throw blanket with hands that shook slightly. Not from shame, but from adrenaline, from the way my entire body still echoed with the sensation of his touch. And when I finally looked at him again, sitting at the edge of the bed now, already wearing the shirt he'd brought with him, he didn't try to pull me back or speak into the silence. I think we both knew that what we'd shared belonged to the night and the rain and the hour between confessions and consequences. When Michael returned around 7, his voice carried through the hallway with the same cheerful exhaustion it always had after night shifts, the sound of a man who still trusted the life he was walking into. And I greeted him at the door with a smile that came from the same place all my performances did. That soft, practiced curve of the mouth that made things easier for everyone else. And he kissed me on the temple like usual and said he needed a shower and maybe something light for breakfast. And as he disappeared into the bathroom, I stood in the kitchen pretending to look for eggs while I waited for my pulse to settle into something that could pass for calm. Nathan came downstairs 10 minutes later, his hair already dry, his posture relaxed but not lazy, and when he saw me standing at the sink, he didn't pause or retreat or ask how I was. He just nodded and poured himself a glass of water, like nothing about the walls between us had changed. And maybe that was the most terrifying part of all. The way we both seemed to know how to resume the roles we had abandoned only hours earlier without missing a beat, as if the night had been a pause in the script and now the act was back in motion. The morning passed in small rituals and quiet coordination, Michael reading the paper at the table while I brought him coffee, Nathan stepping outside to take a call that probably wasn't important, and me floating between both of them with the weight of last night wrapped tight around my spine, invisible but undeniable. And I caught myself glancing at the clock, not because I was keeping track of time, but because I was searching for something to measure myself against. Something solid, something that didn't shift under the pressure of what we had become. After lunch, while Michael took a nap upstairs and the house slipped into that Sunday quiet that usually meant laundry and emails and grocery lists, I went into the guest room to open the window because the air had grown too heavy again, and as I moved the curtain aside, I saw it resting on the nightstand, a folded piece of lined paper with my name written on the outside in his unmistakable handwriting. That neat slant with the slightly curved L he always made, like it mattered how letters touched paper, and I held it in my hand for a long time before I opened it. The note was short, but it burned into me more deeply than I expected. Tell me to leave, and I will. That was all it said. 7 words without flourish or punctuation, but each one carried the weight of an entire choice I hadn't been ready to make, and for a moment I just stood there with the paper pressed between my palms and my heart racing, like it had been caught in something dangerous, because suddenly it wasn't just about desire or secrecy or guilt, it was about permission, about whether I was brave enough to ask for what I wanted or cowardly enough to let him walk away believing I didn't. I didn't answer the note. I didn't write anything in return. Instead, I folded it carefully, smoothed the creases, and slid it between the pages of the book on my nightstand, one I hadn't read in years, but couldn't bring myself to donate. The kind of book people keep not because they love the story, but because they remember who they were when they bought it, and I placed it there like a secret, like a question I hadn't answered yet, and maybe wouldn't. Not because I didn't know how, but because the answer lived too close to the fire I had already let in. Michael was supposed to be gone until at least 9, attending some regional business conference at the Marriott downtown, where men in navy suits traded jargon over bad coffee and screen-shared slides they would forget by morning. And because he kissed me on the forehead before leaving and reminded me to water the basil plant and lock the back gate, I believed him. Not because he had never lied, but because routine makes us careless. And when the front door closed behind him and the car pulled out of the driveway, the air in the house shifted the way it does when expectations dissolve and something unspoken moves in to take their place. I wasn't dressed for anything dramatic, just wearing an old t-shirt of his that hung loosely off one shoulder and a pair of soft shorts I only wore around the house. And I remember thinking that maybe the clouds looked less threatening than the forecast said, that maybe the day would stay warm and quiet and suspended in that lazy tension that filled the rooms now whenever Nathan and I were alone. And I was halfway through folding laundry in the bedroom when I felt him behind me, his hand brushing against the back of my shoulder in a way that wasn't sexual but wasn't casual either. A kind of careful intention that hummed beneath the surface like static electricity. I didn't pull away. Not this time. Not after what we'd already done. Not after the note he'd left me that I still hadn't responded to because I didn't know how to ask him to stay or tell him to leave when both felt like tearing something alive from inside me. And his expression wasn't eager or rushed, just calm and focused, like he was waiting without pressure. and I stepped forward before I could stop myself, and he kissed me gently, as if trying to communicate something he couldn't quite say, until there was only the sound of our breathing and the soft rustle of fabric and the pulse in my throat that reminded me how alive I still was. Neither of us heard the door. Not the creak of it swinging open, nor the soft gust of air it brought. With it, not the weight of footsteps or the pause that must have come as he looked for me in the kitchen or glanced toward the den, because we were too caught in that moment at the edge of the hallway, too folded into each other to remember the world beyond the frame of the doorway. And when I finally opened my eyes, it was not because I sensed something wrong, but because Nathan tensed slightly under my hand, and when I turned toward the living room, I saw Michael standing there just beyond the archway, his bag still in his hand and his face blank except for the sharp narrowing of his eyes and the muscle twitching just above his jaw. There was a silence that cracked through me sharper than any scream could have, a single suspended breath that lasted forever and not long enough. And then his voice, low and splintered and filling the space between us like glass scattered across hardwood, said, "What the fuck is this?" Each word slow and jagged like it physically hurt him to form the sentence, and my mouth opened. But nothing came out because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound like a betrayal carved in apology. Nathan moved first, stepping forward, placing himself slightly in front of me, with a tension in his shoulders I'd never seen before. And he didn't raise his voice, but it filled the room anyway when he said, "You don't have to speak to her like that." And for a second, I hated him for protecting me because it made it real. It made everything visible and undeniable. And Michael dropped his bag with a thud and took 2 quick steps forward and said, "My own nephew," like the sentence was poison, and he needed to spit it out before it burned through his throat. I tried to say something then. I don't remember what, maybe his name, maybe a plea for quiet, maybe just a sound to interrupt the flood. But he didn't let me speak, didn't look at me, didn't see the tears that had already started to fall, because he was too busy turning all of his fury onto Nathan, who stood there without flinching as Michael said words I can't write, because they came from a place beyond betrayal, a place made of heat and grief and disbelief that someone he trusted could turn into a stranger right in front of him. The room felt too small for the 3 of us, too loud and too broken and too full of memory, and when Nathan finally said, "I'll go," Michael didn't stop him, just turned away and grabbed his keys from the counter with a sharpness that made the metal clink like gunfire. And as the ducker slammed behind him and the car engine growled to life, I realized I was still holding the edge of Nathan's sleeve, not tightly, but enough for him to feel. And he looked at me one last time with something close to apology in his eyes, and then he pulled away and left, not saying goodbye, not saying anything at all. The sound of the front door closing behind. Nathan didn't echo like it should have, didn't slam or shake the walls or rattle the glassware on the shelf above the stairs. It just shut quietly, almost politely, like even in that final moment he didn't want to break the house anymore than we already had. And I stood there alone in the middle of the hallway with my hands still open like I might call him back or stop the unraveling or rewind time to the moment before Michael walked through the door and saw me wearing his old t-shirt while wrapped in someone else's arms. The living room felt suddenly unfamiliar. Too big and too hollow. The couch still warm from where we had sat last night pretending everything could stay contained inside stolen glances and small gestures, and I could still smell the citrus of Nathan's cologne clinging faintly to the air like it hadn't realized it no longer belonged here. And I pressed my back against the wall and slid down to the floor slowly, not dramatically, but because my legs no longer seemed interested in holding me upright. And when I touched my face, I realized I had been crying for longer than I knew. Upstairs, I could hear Michael pacing, his footsteps heavy and irregular, like he couldn't decide what to do first, whether to pack something or break something or scream into the silence that now stretched between us like a canyon. And I didn't follow him, didn't call out, didn't try to explain because I could already feel the wall going up between us brick by slow brick, built from every lie of omission, every touch I didn't stop, every moment I let myself believe we weren't already standing at the edge of this fracture. Eventually, I heard him come down the stairs again. Faster this time, each step sharp, like a warning. And he didn't even glance in my direction as he grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door and took his keys from the bowl beside the mirror. And I tried to speak then, not because I thought words could fix it, but because silence felt like surrender. And I said his name once, just once, and he stopped at the door but didn't turn around, didn't let me see his face as he said, "Don't," in a voice that sounded more tired than angry, and then he opened the door and left, not slamming it this time but closing it with a kind of finality that said he didn't know when or if he'd come back. The rest of the day passed like a dream, where nothing is solid and time folds in on itself without explanation. Hours ticked. By without meaning, shadows moved across the floors and walls like they were following someone else's schedule, and I wandered through the house touching things I couldn't feel, like the edge of the dining table, the cool porcelain of the sink, the frame on the mantel that used to hold a photo of the three of us at Lake Windermere, laughing with squinted eyes and wind-tangled hair, a photo that now sat face down like it couldn't bear to witness what we had become. By late evening, the quiet had grown so loud I thought it might crush me, and I walked upstairs slowly, checking the guest room even though I already knew it was empty. And when I opened the door, the absence hit me like a punch, not in the noise or the mess, but in the complete and deliberate order of it. The bed made, the dresser cleared, the toothbrush gone from the bathroom, the charger no longer plugged into the wall, and I stood there gripping the doorframe with both hands because there was no trace of him left, except the memory of how his presence had made everything in that room feel bigger and warmer and filled with possibilities I had not dared to imagine in years. Walked to the bed and sat down gently, half expecting some forgotten item to reveal itself, a sock under the chair or a note tucked between pages of the book he had borrowed from the hallway shelf. But there was nothing, not even a wrinkle in the comforter that suggested hesitation, and I pressed my palm against the mattress anyway, as if maybe the heat of his body might still be buried in the fabric, as if maybe I could draw it out just long enough to remember what it felt like to be wanted that completely. Downstairs, the silence waited for me like a sentence I hadn't finished, and I checked my phone again even though there were no notifications, no calls, no texts, nothing but the last message from the dry cleaner and the calendar alert about the vet appointment next Tuesday, and I stared at the blank screen for a long time before setting it face down on the kitchen counter like the photo on the mantel, because everything now felt like it belonged face down. Michael didn't return that night, Nathan didn't call, and I didn't sleep. I just lay there in the dark with the rain having long stopped, and the world outside wrapped in the kind of stillness that doesn't soothe but haunts. And when I finally sat up to look out the window at the empty driveway, I realized that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of everything you thought you could hold on to, now echoing in all the places they've already left. 10 days passed, without a single word, not a message or a call or a slammed door echoing down the hallway, only silence pressed into every corner of the house like dust that had settled during some long absence. Except the absence wasn't physical, it was emotional. And it was absolute, because Michael hadn't returned since the night he walked out with his keys clenched in one hand and his back turned so tightly I knew without asking that there would be no gentle re-entry, no moment of collapse or reconciliation waiting at the edges of his temper. And Nathan, for all the things he had said with his eyes and his hands and his body, had disappeared even faster, leaving no scent, no text, not even a breadcrumb trail of regret that I could cling to, while the hours stretched longer than they should and the nights became darker than I remembered. Each morning I woke in a bed that still smelled faintly of laundry detergent and something else I didn't want to name, and I moved through the house like someone caught between stages of grief, too numb to cry but too raw to pretend that any of this was temporary, and I stopped opening the curtains in the guest room because the sunlight on the empty bed made it worse, and I stopped checking the front porch because the mailbox never held anything worth reading. And I stopped replying to casual texts from old friends who didn't know enough to ask the right questions and wouldn't have known what to do if I had told them the truth in full color. One afternoon, I sat on the edge of the couch with a cup of tea growing cold between my palms and stared at the photo on the bookshelf, the one I had forgotten to hide, the one with the three of us standing side by side in front of the house on a day when none of us had any idea how fragile things really were. Michael in his navy jacket with one hand on my waist and the other holding Nathan's shoulder like he still believed blood meant protection. Me in the middle, smiling with my head slightly tilted because I always leaned toward the person who needed it most. And Nathan with that quiet half smirk that never gave too much away. And I stared at that photo until my hands went numb. And then I stood, walked to the kitchen without looking down, opened the drawer, and dropped the frame inside the bin with a clatter that felt louder than anything I had heard in a week. That night, just after 6, I found an envelope slipped through the mail slot, white, clean, without a return address, and I didn't need to open it to know what was inside because the weight of it felt too final to be anything but what it was. And still, I opened it at the table under the kitchen light because some part of me still clung to the idea that understanding might offer relief, and there it was. Divorce papers, neat and clinical and signed without comment, no note, no letter. Not even a scribbled word beside the signature that used to end birthday cards and anniversary gifts with a looping "love always" that I now couldn't imagine meaning anything at all. I sat there for a long time, not reading the legal text, not flipping through the pages, just staring at the signature like it was a stranger's name. And then I placed the envelope on the counter and walked upstairs and didn't turn on the lights, because the dark was easier now, more honest, less confusing. And I stood in front of the mirror and looked at my reflection for the first time in days, seeing not what I had become but what I had lost, the shape of familiarity, the comfort of roles, the lie of safety. The next morning, I went to open Netflix, hoping for noise or distraction or anything that would let me forget how quiet everything had become. And instead of the usual welcome screen, I saw a login prompt I hadn't seen in years, a blank rectangle asking for credentials that were no longer mine. And at first I thought it was a glitch until I checked Amazon and saw the same thing. Saw that I had been signed out not only digitally but symbolically, scrubbed from the shared world we once lived in together. And it didn't make me cry. It didn't make me scream. It just made something tighten in my chest, because there was no clearer message than a password that no longer worked. I stood in the middle of the living room holding the remote in one hand and my phone in the other, both useless, both suddenly foreign, and I understood in that moment that being erased doesn't always come in arguments or slammed doors or shouted words. It can come in the quiet dismantling of small things, in the quiet deletion of presence, in the refusal to acknowledge that you ever belonged at all. That afternoon, the weather turned again, as if the sky had been paying attention to the quiet collapse of my life and decided it should match the mood inside the house, and I left without knowing why, walking aimlessly down streets I had driven through 100 times but never really noticed. The soles of my shoes making soft sounds against the damp concrete, the clouds hanging low and swollen with a weight that matched the one in my chest, and I moved like someone searching for a reason to stop moving, past the bakery where we used to get croissants on Sundays, past the dog park where Michael once said he wanted to adopt a second beagle, past the corner bench where I had once kissed. Nathan on the inside of my imagination before it ever happened in real life. When I turned onto Pine Street, just 2 blocks from the bookstore where Nathan had browsed endlessly through the architecture section, I saw him on the other side of the road, walking alone in the opposite direction with his head slightly down and his hands tucked into the pockets of a jacket I didn't recognize. And the moment my eyes landed on him, I stopped moving entirely, because I hadn't expected to see him again, and I hadn't prepared myself for what it might do to me. And for a second I hoped he hadn't seen me at all, that I might turn away or fade into a storefront shadow. But then he looked up and his gaze locked onto mine with a directness that knocked the breath out of my lungs. We stared at each other across the narrow divide of an empty street with only the breeze and the first slow drops of rain separating us. And he didn't smile or nod or move toward me. He just looked, steady and unreadable, as if trying to decide whether this version of me was the same woman who had once kissed him with everything she had or someone else entirely. And then he blinked once, turned his face away, and kept walking with the kind of deliberate stride that told me everything I didn't want to know. He wasn't going to stop, he wasn't going to speak, and whatever he had felt that night beneath the rain had ended the moment Michael's voice filled the room. I didn't chase him. I didn't call his name. Just stood there on the wet sidewalk with my arms crossed tightly across my stomach and my phone clutched in one hand like I was waiting for a message that would never come. And the rain started falling heavier then, not in dramatic sheets, but in a steady patter that soaked through my hair and into the seams of my sweater, until I could feel the cold pressing against my back, and still I didn't move because it felt like penance. Like some part of me had known all along that this was how it would end. Not in fire or heartbreak, but in absence and rain, and the hollow echo of footsteps moving away from me without hesitation. I stayed there long enough to watch his figure disappear into the distance, swallowed by the turn of the block and the steady blur of water on glass. And when I finally looked down at my phone, the screen was still dark. No missed calls, no texts, no alerts, no one looking for me or checking in or asking where I had gone. And the loneliness hit me then with a precision I hadn't expected. Not sharp, but total, like a room you suddenly realize has no doors or windows and never did. I walked home slowly, letting the rain fall without raising my hood or hurrying my steps, passing people who didn't notice me, stepping through puddles that soaked my socks, crossing intersections where the lights meant nothing because I was moving without purpose. And when I reached the house, the lights were still off, the mailbox still empty, the silence still waiting like a loyal dog inside the front door, and I stripped out of my wet clothes and left them in a pile by the washer without turning it on, stepping barefoot across the tile and into the bedroom that no longer held anything sacred. That night, I didn't try to distract myself with television or music or the empty loop of social media. I just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the house settling around me and the wind brushing against the windows and the memory of Nathan's breath in the dark. And I realized that no matter how many nights pass or how many people fill the silence again someday, I will always remember this one summer not for what it gave me, but for what it revealed. I had been seen. I had been ruined. All in one summer.